Hi, folks. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Stanford Digital Economy Lunch Seminar. Today's speaker is Sandy Pentland. He runs the MIT Human Dynamics Lab at the MIT Media Lab Entrepreneurship Program. He also co-leads the World Economic Forum Big Data and Personal Data Initiatives and is a founding member of the advisory boards at Nissan, Motorola, Mobility, Telefonica, and a lot of startup firms. And he's also a visiting scholar here at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. During the seminar, we welcome questions. If you're in the Zoom audience, please submit your question using the Q&A function you see there at the bottom of the screen, not the chat function, the Q&A function. And if you're here at Stanford, just raise your hand and I'll call on you, or maybe Sandy will directly. I think the norm is that if you have sort of a clarifying question during the seminar, feel free to ask it. And hopefully, Sandy, you can have like a few minutes at the end when we have more broader questions. So welcome back, Sandy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about economic tails, which is this double entendre, obviously. And it's work towards understanding tail events. So recently, we've had a bunch of events that are tail events, like, for instance, the run on Silicon Valley Bank, the run on First Republic. Deutsche Bank was being hammered. Credit Suisse was hammered. People were worried about this, right? But it's not because of there was these organizations didn't have the assets. It's because they had this sudden demand pushed by social media, other sorts of things that caused them problems. And of course, there's a number of other things that have happened in this sort of thing, like, for instance, the GameStop bubble and so forth. And one of the main problems is that while we think about most economic things as being decisions by lots of individuals, these individuals influence each other. And what that means is that you can get these cascade events which have economic ramifications. And what you'd like to do, or what I'd like to do, is I'd like to understand the cascade events and how they couple with economic outcomes. So this is not so different from a lot of the sort of things you see about political memes and fake news and things like that. It's just that now it's coupled to economic events, and it has some sort of immediate real world effect and sometimes really catastrophic effects. So in thinking about this, I think the first thing that we have to do is you have to say, well, why are we all like interacting with each other? Why aren't we sort of rational individuals? And so this question of why are we social? Why do we continue to do that? Is this just some reason that we're compelled to do? It's fashionable, or is there actually an underlying information theoretic reason? And there is, I think, a very strong reason. And that is to ask yourself, why would we do this? Well, the classic answer is around faster spread of innovation. But they're thinking about this in terms of I tell you a theory or something like that. But if what I'm trying to do is test a hypothesis, I'm trying to consider what is the evidence for something, then typically I need lots of samples of that. And it's very expensive to do it myself. So what I'd actually like to do is I'd like to watch you and see that you invested in that and it didn't work. That saves me from investing in that, right? Or see that you guys all bought X and it worked out wonderfully. So that tells me that might be a good thing. So it's that sort of learning from each other that I think is actually the key thing, not so much actual explicit instruction. And this learning from each other has a number of characteristics. One thing is that if I'm paying attention to everybody else, then you end up in a preferential attachment zone where if he does really, really well, people will notice and start copying him. And then people will copy the copiers, and suddenly you get these tail events, right? So this is very familiar from social media. And of course, it happens in economics as well. Black swans, gray swans are often this type of a thing. And that, yeah.
So you said faster spread of innovation. Preferential attachment has existed, so I think there's something that's changed, like presumably social media, digitization, networks.
Yeah. So the thing that everyone says is something like I communicate to you in language this model, okay? But actually, I would also observe people and copy what they do. But now that we have social media, now that we have broadcast media, we can communicate these sorts of trends much faster. The attachment happens orders of magnitude faster, and it's larger because this goes all around the world. So this suddenly becomes not just a little cascade, it becomes a huge cascade.
It's a combination of preferential attachment plus digital media.
That's right. Yeah. So another thing that happens here is that we want to do this sort of looking from other people, learning from other people, because of something called ergodicity. So if you look at most of the sort of mathematics around economics, it assumes that the sample that you have is typical of the long-range large sample. It's called ergodicity. But of course, for any small finite sample, that's not true. So what you'd like to do is have larger samples. Sort of just learning from my experience, I want to learn from your experience too. And this is especially true in non-stationary situations where to be able to know that something's actually changing and which direction it's going, you need lots and lots of samples, much more than typically you can do yourself. Okay, so this sort of watching people really matters. And when you watch people, you can also turn out that you're watching the wrong features and you think things happen when in fact they happen for some other reason. These are called confounders in statistics. What all of these sorts of things do, right, this pressure to learn from other people, right, through social media, what that does is that gives you additional samples, but all of these effects, the sort of preferential attachment, the non-stationarity, non-ergodic, myopia, undermine hypothesis testing. They mean that you need lots more samples, and the only way to get that is through social observation of lots of people, but that gives rise to faster and more of these cascades. And I'll show you a little bit about that. So hopefully that sort of shows you what we're trying to think about is how does the conversation between people, the learning between people affect economic outcomes? So, and it's not just economic, all sorts of outcomes. So the typical model we have of people is this, deductive decision model. We have a bunch of things we know. We try to decide what's going to happen. And we are limited in our rationality. Also, if you look at the mathematics that people use, they're usually compact distributions. There's noise in there, but it's not long-tailed noise typically, right? So what that means is the black swans and gray swans don't go in there in the theorems about convergence and so forth. And similarly, they think about stable models at equilibrium. But all of these pressures to have more and more samples induce preferential attachment cascades, induces all these other sorts of things. And the only way to get around those is just to have lots and lots more samples. Okay. People talk about social proof as a way to do this. So I observe you and then I reason about it. But that doesn't really get you very far because now you have to look at the logic of how do you reason about what other people do. It's a very complicated thing to do. There is, however, an alternate model from the one that we typically use. And I'll call this a social inductive decision model. And it's been around since 1937 in the individual case. And recently we've been able to extend it to the network case. Okay? So what it does is, some of the names for it are distributed bandit problems. Bandits in this case are like slot machines, or it's a typical thing that is called Bayesian portfolio theory, where you're trying to look at lots of different strategies and adaptively decide which ones to do. So it has the rationality in there, the individual rationality, but it integrates all the learning from other people through a prior observational prior. So you see what other people do, that gives you probabilities of different sorts of strategies working out. You multiply them together, and that gives you a posterior. And you might say, well, okay, how good is this? Is this a reasonable thing to do? And the answer is it's really pretty good. If you look at this in the case of the individual, It has very strong optimality properties. And in fact, we've been able to extend this to networks of individuals observing each other, and it maintains most of the strong optimality. So it converges as fast as is possible. It has the most robust behavior to non-stationarity and non-ergodicity. It's really a very, very good thing. And you can now also make it something where the observations are closer to the real world. In other words, that not everything is public knowledge. You have adversaries trying to trick you by giving you false data. That could be long-tailed, these sort of black swan type things. And it turns out that it's robust to all of these. Not perfectly robust, but much more robust than you might expect. And here's a couple of the papers that we've published in this, which have been pretty well taken. People are citing them like mad and actually using it to be able to integrate, for instance, medical knowledge across lots of different hospitals to make better treatment decisions. The reason it's interesting is this sort of thing. So this shows people making decisions using various standard methods of deciding in how many samples you need to get a good estimate of what is the best strategy to use. Okay? Takes a long time to converge. But if you do the sort of things that we were just talking about, you can get much more dramatically better convergence. So what this is doing is actually a fairly simple thing. What it's doing is it's looking at samples, doing just what everybody else does, which is looking at the likelihoods of the different strategies, but it's also remembering things that don't fit the probability distributions very well and holding them aside. And then you go back at the end and you ask, well, are the ones that we've held aside, does that change our models of the probability distributions? So think about this in a sort of personal cases. What you do is you say, I don't know what that's an outlier. I'm just going to remember that. And if you get a bunch of outliers, you suddenly say, well, wait, why do I have a whole bunch of outliers in this one sort of direction? Maybe there's something different going on. And you change your model of the environment to include a lot more outliers. So for instance, you should never ever say something like, this is a 26 standard deviation event, or probably not even a 1 in 100-year event. It says that the distribution is not, your model of distribution is not right. Yes.
Let me see if I'm getting this to say it back. So first you have a model and you fit the data to that model.
Correct.
But then there's a second thing you do, which is see whether or not you should change the entire model.
That's
and
right.
Every once in a while you say, wait a minute, there's so many outliers that the model I've been trying to fit is wrong. So then you switch to a new model. And those are two separate data gathering exercises, one to fit the existing model, one to decide whether your model.
They're not separate data gathering,
or data
separate analytics.
Analytics, yeah.
So in this sort of distributed bandit, you have a bunch of different alternative models. And you're asking, how do my observations update each of these models? But sometimes they don't fit any of the models. And so you keep those to the side and you come back to your models and you say, wait a second, something's wrong here. Maybe some of these models are really in the wrong way.
Say you sort of set aside some of those outliers. Is that literal, or is that just to help us, a tool for helping us? Because it seems to me you'd want to just, with every single data point, you get one that's right in the middle of the distribution, say, okay, the model's more likely. You get one that's 4 standard deviations, say, oh, that makes the model a little less likely. And every single data point, it seems like you could continuously update your probability that you've got.
And that would be the best way to do it. That's right, yeah. But you might collect them a little bit just for efficiency's case, right? But that's really the right thing. So you're estimating both the distribution.
What is your cost of doing that questioning? But if there's zero cost of questioning, you would just continuously, with each data point, you'd
that's right.
You'd update your probability that you have the right model.
That's right. Yeah. So it's actually a fairly simple algorithm. It's sort of intuitive to people, but what's really remarkable is how much better that works. And notice that this is something that works a lot better than the sort of standard deductive model. It's an inductive model where you're trying to sort of say, well, maybe my assumptions about the distribution, about the possibilities aren't correct, and I'm going to have to update those too. Okay? So a good question is do people do this? And we have this huge data set, many hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world trading mostly Forex on a platform called eToro. So it's an Israeli company. What is unusual, though, is you can see what everybody is doing, what strategies they've adopted. You can't see the dollar amount, but you can see how well that strategy is working on the day, the week, and the month. So you can see if this is something that's working well. You can, in other words, integrate the experience of lots of other people in choosing your own strategy. And in fact, you can do things like take your own portfolio and allocate it to certain people, like 10% here, 20% on that guy, and so forth, so that you exactly follow their strategy. And the question is, of course, do people follow this model of distributed strategy consideration, distributed bandits? And the answer is they seem to do it really quite well, but there's some caveats. So people, in fact, adopt strategies that do better, and they drop strategies that don't do better. There's, of course, buyer's regret bias in there. But they are equally responsive to popularity, because remember, they can see lots of people. And so when they see lots of people doing well on a strategy, that enhances their likelihood of adopting that strategy. If they see lots of people losing, that enhances their probability of dropping. And they quite literally multiply those two things together in their head, and you get the posterior, which is what they act on. Okay, and they don't just act on one posterior, they do the first couple in a distributed, depending on the
Sandy, two questions about the mechanics of what you're describing here. One is, so you showed you could observe the percentage gain, 28% or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the first part. Is there, maybe I missed it, is there also like how many people pick this strategy? Is that a number that, are those the two numbers, or is there something like that?
You can, they have a popularity, how many people are following this thing. Mm-hmm. But there's also the ones you can observe. How often do you observe it among the set of people that you think are like you? That's another sort of complication.
I see.
But they do have the popularity number, and they have the return on investment.
And those other people that you're watching are doing the same thing.
That's right.
Is there some kind of like recursive or fixed point thing where they're all like, because they may be copying you or copying somebody else.
And so the ensemble moves around. And what's interesting is that the most popular things in that ensemble are actually great strategies. They change constantly, but those strategies are, it's sort of funny, but what people do is if they came to it and they just picked the most popular ones, they'd trade very well, they'd make a lot of money, but they don't. People have all these biases. They like their own countrymen, they like people of the same gender or whatever. And so they have a really fairly wide range of returns, even though what's staring them in the face is these most popular things, which are actually excellent. So that's interesting because the individuals are not behaving in a completely rational way, but the ensemble is. And that's just exactly what you'd expect from this little bit of mathematics. It's lots of noisy observations, but the ensemble works better. So it's a sort of a collective intelligence type thing. And there's a paper in Cognition about this. And this is actually sort of important because it talks about how did our brains form? Why did we become social? And it's saying that, maybe what's going on here is we're sort of always lost. We have some deductive abilities, but really what we're trying to do is just see what works and copy that, even if we don't know why. And we're sort of like this joint organism looking for the best strategies, which I think is a very sort of attractive thing. But you could say, maybe this isn't something that experts do. Maybe this is just people playing the game, with a few $1,000s, things like that. And so we ran a course for expert traders. So these are mid-career financial traders that we have 2,000 of them in our course. And we had some exercises, one of which was to predict the price of various commodities 1 week, 2-week, et cetera, in the future. Okay? And then, so we gave them the price history of the commodity. We had them bet on it, forecast it. And then what we did was something unusual. We showed them what everybody else did. Okay? So this is what everybody else thinks is going to happen. So oil futures or whatever, right? And some of them would change their bet on what is the right sort of price for a week ahead. Some wouldn't. So in other words, some just stuck to the numbers, and some were influenced by this social prior, as it were. Have any idea what would happen to the? Remember, these are professionals. They do this for a living, and they're good at it, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be employed. So who's going to do better? The ones who are pure quant, or the people who are quant plus social, time social? Any guess? Okay, well, sort of a trick question. Because really what happens is there's a Pareto frontier in terms of Sharpe ratio, in terms of risk versus reward. The ones who are pure quants actually do a little bit better, but they make horrible mistakes occasionally. The ones who do the social make many fewer mistakes and give up a little bit of yield. Now, if you've ever sort of been involved in things like this, you know that those mistakes are really crucial. Those sort of tail events, the things you didn't expect, that's what determines whether your portfolio really thrives in a year. It's good to have all those little increments. If you could trade a little bit of the increment for never making a bad mistake, you'd do it in an instant. That's really interesting that you see the same type of performance here. There's for those of you who care about sort of human cognition and how we do this, there's an interesting parallel here that we've been exploiting and exploring in social media and other places, which is that we know that in human behavior, we have attentional mechanisms, and then we have cognitive mechanisms for consideration. So we very quickly and apparently in parallel scan the world for things that might be interesting, and then we focus our attention on them and we consider them, like whether we need to run or grab them or whatever. Those are called system 1 and system 2. System 1 is this immediate thing. System 2 is this longer term thing. There are a little bit of caricatures because it sort of blends between them. But it turns out that our immediate attentive mechanism is, to a very large degree, a social attention mechanism. The things you're exposed to and have your attention drawn to as a little kid in your society are the things that everybody knows are interesting and worth additional scrutiny. And then, of course, you have your personal preferences, which are more cognitive and take longer. So how does this work out in social media, for instance? So this is a current thesis. Ziv Epstein is going to join you guys. So built a platform where you could sort of scroll through social media, but we were instrumenting the people. And what we found was that you could measure something called dwell time, which is how long people looked at it, a particular post. And that was something that is like this system 1 thing. Very quickly, you pick certain things out to focus on, right? And then when you pick something out, you would actually click on it usually, and then you would think about it for much longer. And they had very different characteristics. So this attentional mechanism was focused on the sensational. And really no way to sort of characterize these as credible. It was just too fast, didn't pay attention to that. But the consideration part focused the opposite way. It was on the credibility and not the how sensational it was. So in other words, you're scanning the world for threats or opportunities, and when you find one, you think about it. So that's exactly this mechanism of a social prior times a cognitive consideration, and that gives you your action of what you're going to do. And interesting, this is the same type of thing we saw in a famous experiment called Music Lab, where people had to look at lots of different musics and say, oh, which ones am I going to actually download? And so they would look at the popularity, they would look at the title of the music, and if it looked like something that was interesting, then they would sample it more. So again, a scanning and a downloading. So all of that, I hope you find fairly compelling, is that there's this other way to think about these decisions that are not just heuristic and not just deductive. It's really this trying to search the world for strategies and opportunities that are useful. And that's this distributed portfolio, distributed bandit sort of problem. One of the things about that is that the math of this works if the people that you're looking at are people who have the same utilities that you do. So if you try to copy people who have different utilities, then you'll pick things that are just not going to work for you. So if I pick things that work for a 6-year-old, and that's most of what I'm looking at, I'm not going to do very well in the world. I need to pick people that have similar utilities, similar capabilities. And in fact, we have papers about this where we looked at this and we said, well, what would happen if the people I picked were just random individuals? How well would I do? And this is Sharpe ratio again. So this is really good here. That's not so bad. And you can see that groups of people, sort of 1 through 8, 10 people, help you in making good decisions. But if you have a fixed team so that you can judge how well each of the people you're observing does. So in other words, I know that you're really good, but you tend to make mistakes. So I can weight you differently. I can do much better. So having some history, some reputation mechanism helps people do better. And if in fact I pick people that have similar utilities, so people I know a priori are very similar to me, and I watch those, I do much, much, much better than I do if I just watch random people, or even if I know people pretty well, but they were randomly picked. So that's this notion of who do you learn with, and people change who they pay attention to. That's part of this social thing. The result of that, of course, though, is echo chambers, because I'm going to pay attention to people like me, right? And so if you look, for instance, at Twitter, these are geolocated Twitter accounts around the whole several large geographies. You find, you might think that Twitter goes to everybody, but if you're high income, the only people who pay attention and retweet it are high income people. If you're low income, the only people that pay attention and retweet it are low income. If you're middle class, it's somewhere in the middle. So Twitter has this implicit stratification, segregation, because people are paying attention to people like them, even though that's not visible in the Twitter account. It doesn't say, I make this much money, right? The concerns you have, yeah.
We have a clarifying question from online. Is similar utility based on preferences or based on demographics?
It's not based on demographics. Demographics is halfway good at predicting utility, but just the fact that you're a 60-year-old male doesn't mean that I can really accurately predict your preferences. So these are much closer to preferences, okay? And you shouldn't think of them as, oh, I like pink bow ties or something like that. It's what's important to you. What are you willing to actually put money on? What are you willing to work for? It's those sorts of preferences, the things that you want to do. Yeah.
There's a follow-up question, which I think is similar to that. Does the preference to pick things out based on social familiarity biases interact with novelty effects? Is there a separate or compounded novelty effect in the case of a lack of social prior?
So everybody has two tendencies, and this is part of this sort of distributed bandit problem. Sometimes you want to explore some when you're uncertain, and most of the time you'll be exploiting, which is to say you'll find things, learn from people like you. But since you don't know perfectly who's like you, and those people may not have all the different strategies that you need, you explore some. people who explore more do better. Okay. And there's all sorts of ramifications there. Like, for instance, it turns out that if you grew up in a poor neighborhood and you suffered traumas, you don't explore very much because you know it's dangerous. But that means you don't do very well later in life also. Okay, so I think that's halfway answered the question. Okay. So this is the part that people who are interested in crypto really like. How am I doing on time? Doing okay. So I've given you a model that says, no, we're not trying to reason things out. What people are normally trying to do is observe other people and their own behavior and try and adopt a series of strategies that suit them the most. And they tend to look at people who are similar to them to be able to do that because that's a higher performing strategy for learning. Now, does this actually work for predicting things? Well, so think of this as having a community that is connected by springs in some sense, influences. So all the people here, I'm going to learn from you and you and you in various ways. So we're all connected. And if we're not very similar, then the connection between us is looser. If we're quite similar, the connection is stronger because I can learn from you more. Does this actually do a good job of predicting these sort of instabilities? So let's look at a couple things. So several years ago, there were a hot thing out there in the crypto world was altcoins. So these are essentially relabeled Bitcoins that had their own sort of trading ecology, but they were fairly thin. So there weren't a huge number of trades there, and they weren't typically, they started off very low price and sometimes they went up. And the question would be, what determines the market value there? And even being a poor university, we could do things like we could make some purchases of altcoins at very carefully timed points and see what happened. Now, if the mental model for this sort of community is a bunch of observers looking for things that win, and they're connected in some sense by these cognitive springs, what you'd expect is if you do something that's striking, you'd get to see it propagate. And you'd see that as a price signal. Okay? And that's exactly what you do. So if you time a tiny little purchase, so often these are like 10 cents, right? In a market with millions of dollars. What you see is a quite substantial change in the price of this asset based on exactly when you do it. So if you make it look like a momentum play, so you see something going up and you put that one little purchase in there, confirming that the price continues to go up, then the next sales price will be quite a bit higher. And this is an amplification factor of like 500. So if you were going to be, for instance, an exchange handling a lot of this particular altcoin, this would be a brilliant thing to do, perfectly legal. You put little purchases in there, the price goes up, and remember, people are selling through the exchange, so you get a percentage of all that off the top. And it goes both up and down, but an optimistic market, so it goes up more than it goes down. And then after about 15, 20 minutes, the effect dies down. So that spring sort of dies down. Pretty interesting, right? Goes in both directions. The negative is not quite as strong an effect. Or here's another one we did. So this is, again, with these altcoins. We looked at, so what happens with the altcoins is they're introduced, and then used to be, it's not quite the same today, there was one forum, like a Reddit forum, where people talked about it. They said, there's this new coin, it has this wonderful thing, and all the people who are interested in these, all the crypto guys, were reading the same forums and posting to them. So you could say, what's the connection between the advertising of a new coin, who advertises it, who do they advertise it to, and the price of the coin? And if you look at things like, the people being talked to are younger in terms of they're new to this area, to the crypto, or older. The younger ones are more volatile. Okay, that's volatility on the axis. if you look at the entropy, so how broadly do they spread their sort of announcements about things? Again, things that are focused are better than things that are just everywhere. So you're really trying to hammer these younger guys. And if you look at the number of voices, so this is the log degree of the announcement thread, so you and your buds are all like doing the same thing. So then everybody's buying it. And what you get overall is you get these three factors can predict volatility of the coin pretty well. It's like a 0.7 correlation. You can make real money off of this, right? But it's interesting. So by changing the influence between people, their consciousness of what's going on, you can change the volatility. The way you make money, of course, in this area is not by holding things. It's by cashing in on the volatility. So this is, again, for an exchange, this is brilliant. That make sense? Okay. So here's a hypothetical thing. So I don't mean to take this too serious, but I want to illustrate why you should pay attention to this. So this is something you're taught in Psych 101, I guess, right? Demand, supply, yay. But if actually the decision to buy something is a function of how many other people are doing it, then actually you're going to get a curve that looks like that. And the suppliers are going to say, oh, God, everybody's buying this, right? So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to change their behavior too. Yeah, so this is something, you can think of this as having lots of marketing, but this is implicit marketing because people pay attention to each other, not an explicit type of a thing. So we looked at this, and this is a paper in the National Academy.
It seems to, if you go back to that chart.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you see more people with demand, isn't there positive feedback? Why would social be lower than demand curve?
So here you have to remember that all these things are in competition with each other. Okay, so here's a new product, but nobody's buying it. So I'm not going to buy it. Even though it looks pretty good.
I see. Okay, gotcha.
Nobody's going to buy it. But as more and more people buy it, then everybody's doing it. Even if I think it's stupid or too expensive, I'm going to buy it. Right? And the same thing happens indirectly with the suppliers. They say, well, gosh, everybody's doing this, so we're going to make more of them, right? So what does this depend on, and is it real? Because this is just an illustration, right? But so we have this analysis that appears in the National Academy of Science. We show that what this depends on, this nonlinearity depends on, is the entire fitness distribution of all the alternative products. So again, you have all these things, these strategies you might take, and they all have a fitness, and they have attracted a certain number of people, so they have a prior, right? And that fitness distribution determines the stability of the market. And the thing I just showed you was a sort of an instability, right? And so this is a better illustration of it. So in one case, so here's high fit things, low fit things. So fitness in this case is how likely are you to attract more buyers, right? And if you've got a case where most things aren't very interesting, but a few things are quite interesting, then what you end up with is a dominant player, somebody who captures the entire market. It is extremely difficult to dislodge. So the thing that, if you have, on the other hand, something where lots of people are competitive and only a few aren't, maybe the new guys, this remains something where there's a lot of competition. So it is not captured by one person or one or two people. And the important thing about this is it connects the inequality, in this case, inequality of fitness, to stability of the market. So probably everybody here knows about the fundamental welfare theorem, right? It says that you get this clearing of the markets, invisible hand, blah, 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 right? And the answer is it doesn't happen if you have a strongly unequal distribution of fitness. You get capture, which is pretty interesting. And as far as I know, this is really one of the few things that says why inequality is so bad, right? Because here you're saying the fundamental sort of thing a lot of our systems are designed on, breaks when you get too extreme of inequality. Interesting. So this is actually something that we published just recently. It's looking at products on Amazon. It's looking at Bitcoin, and altcoins and things like that. And it's looking at these traders on each. And what this is the rank of these different things. So there's the most popular things and the least popular things, okay? And this is time. And what you find is the low-ranked things almost always sort of climb into this intermediate range where there's lots of competition and things are pretty stable. This is like the fundamental welfare theorem. There's lots of things fighting it out. They're all available. They all are under some price pressure, so they're all pretty good. The guys who are highly fit are much stickier, and they take a long time to get into the decline, but they regularly decline. However, the most fit guys are extremely stable and hard to dislodge in the face of all this competition. And in fact, they very rarely return into the sort of market. They maintain their market status. And a way to think about that is that they're everywhere. Everybody knows them all the time, so they're top of mind. Yeah.
So this is not preferential attachment. Like, what's driving everything towards that 300?
This is preferential attachment.
But wouldn't the preferential attachment lead the leaders to pull further and further away from the others? And
this is rank. So there's lots of competition here. So if you look just at the preference.
But wouldn't the gaps in preferential attachment between each rank grow bigger and bigger?
The gaps grow bigger to a point, but there's enough other sort of people here that they don't grow without bound, right? So even when you have these leaders that are just completely dominant, there's still room for a lot of people. You can think of it as...
In the extreme case of preferential attachment, if somebody's just a tiny bit ahead of someone else, they pull further and further away over time. They don't get pulled back.
Correct. That's what the theorem says.
Yes.
But that's not what actually happens.
That's not. So yeah, what's the difference? What's...
Well, this is, first of all, I don't fully understand this. Okay. So we'd be interested in your idea about it, right? But it's interesting that you get these three different platforms, all of which have preferential attachment, and you see the sorts of effects that we're talking about, where these leaders are incredibly stable, very hard to dislodge, even though there's a lot of innovation going on.
Well, the leaders part makes sense, but so I guess the beyond word is doing some work that there's something else going on, because if it was just the preferential attachment, you get them pulling further and further apart, even if they had an arbitrarily small initial difference.
One way, like for instance, I think it's useful to think about, say, the eToro things. There will be external things that make this trade look really unlikely because you read it in the newspaper, things that aren't captured in the market. And those may be some of the effects that stabilize.
Well, that brings me back to potentially different, but now maybe it's a related question. This performance, it seems like depending on the time frame, it may be different. You know, there are two sayings in finance that people hear a lot. Like, one is the past performance is not indicative of future results. So, a more concrete example of that is the story of picking up nickels in front of the bulldozer, right?
Yeah.
And so you pick up lots of nickels and you're like getting richer and richer. And I was like, wow, this guy's amazing. Look, he's got 30 nickels, 60 nickels, 200 nickels. And then the bulldozer runs him over. And it's like, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good strategy after all. And there are strategies, selling insurance or option related strategies that look a lot like that, where you can consistently make money for dozens or hundreds of periods until you really, really don't.
Yeah.
And so if you had a learning algorithm that copied the people who just seem to keep making money over the time, they'd be very vulnerable to strategies that perhaps inadvertently had that form, like selling insurance.
Yeah, and so this distributed bandit is actually susceptible to that type of a thing, right? Yeah. So you get these cascades that are sometimes irrational, but under
this, in that maybe they're learning, maybe there's somebody who's got a strategy that looks a little bit like that, and people copy, and then the bulldozer comes along and like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. One is that here is this sort of outsized noise that's keeping it from just going all to one thing, probably, right? But the other thing is as far as we know, none of those traders have actually looked at this. Because a lot of trading happens based on rank. Oh, this is the market leader, right? And it turns out that it's not, it's incredibly sticky. Even when it's by looking at the product and price itself, you'd say there's no way it could be, because they have this sort of mind share everywhere, and the preferential attachment process off of that is the best guess that we have about that. So it's interesting because we've never seen this before.
Well,
and it seems to happen across platforms, and it seems to be
preferential attachment is a good idea if the payoffs have some kind of stability to them. But if they could be very different in a future period, either because the world changes or because it's this kind. Well, it's kind of is if it's like
this distributed bandit thing actually is very good at the world changing and at unusual events. Very stable. I mean, you can kill it. Yes, clearly, right. But
unusual those events are.
It has to happen rapidly. That will kill it. So if change happens too faster than the sampling, you lose, right? Because you just essentially get off the sweet spot, and then you have to sort of crawl back slowly if you're still alive. Let me real quick show one more thing here, which is that what I've tried to argue is a couple things. One is that thinking about economics or any sort of thing as a deductive process may be misleading. And actually what you want to think about it is in terms of these bandit problems where you're searching for strategies. Yes, your deductive reasoning helps you pick them, but popularity is a major thing. And that leads to preferential attachment problems and advantages. But of course, it's not just social media that does that, although that's been the thing that has been in the news recently. There's all sorts of things. And some of us are thinking about, well, how do all sorts of things in the world influence, say, economic outcomes or other sort of outcomes? Is this the same type of thing? And can we tell what influences what? Because it's sort of clear here in these cases that, yeah, if they're all talking about Bitcoin and they're buying Bitcoin, then there's a good connection there. But if you're talking about other sorts of networks, does that influence price? We don't know. So what we've developed is what we call calling a causal filtering approach, where you can take very large scale networks of things that might influence each other, but you don't know. And you can very efficiently find things that are good candidates for causal features. Okay, so for instance, you could look at 1 million people on Twitter and ask who's influencing who. I'm not talking about followers. It's like who actually talks to each other. They share ideas. They copy each other, whether or not they're formally following, and so forth. And the technique is basically something that works amazingly well. So just to give you a simple illustration. So imagine you were watching 6 people and you want to look at, say, some metric like how positive are they towards the Ukrainian war, right, or towards the Russians. There's lots of things that they post, and some of them are more or less positive and so forth. And in this case, it's artificial case. We have a signal-to-noise ratio of 1, which means you can't do anything, okay? But because these people are connected, you can determine likely causal connections. And in fact, you can do it really, really well, much more than your intuition would tell you. And the consequence is that you can tell when people are following each other with very high accuracy, when they're influenced by each other, not just follow, because following means different things. But let me give you an example. So for instance, this is China media and Russian social media. And what you can do is you can pick out not only which are the state-backed media, but how the state-backed media in Russia affect the media in China and vice versa. And it turns out that there are very strong couplings. They're helping each other, but not about all issues. So you see bifurcations in what the Chinese will support, what the Russians will support, And those are politically really interesting. Okay, and this won a Best Paper award in a social prediction conference recently. This is something, there's a spinoff that we have that works with the Israeli Defense Force. They gave us 50 known ISIS Twitter accounts and kept 74 aside. And what we had to do is find those 74. And so you're looking through, millions of raw tweets, hundreds of thousands of people. And out of the top 200 that we found, it turned out that we got 72 out of those hundreds of thousands in our top 200 list. Now, that may not impress you unless you do things like machine learning and classification. This is something like 7 nines accuracy. And it's not that we're so smart, it's that this power of coordination and detecting coordination is so surprisingly powerful that you can find connections, causal connections, even in very large amounts of data. And the Israelis have gone on to use this for money laundering and terrorism financing. Again, just looking at these temporal connections that appear to be causal.
Do you have a sense of where the connections, I think you were describing as influencing each other. Can you distinguish that from they have common interests and they all care about the same topic, and so they tweet
the only way,
similar topics?
In the model, I would say you have this sort of social prior, you have your own judgments about likelihood and the posterior. And if you sort of rearrange those and you say, oh, gee, this thing really influences that guy, right? Then you can say something about their utility function. So you can make an estimate of their utility function from the things that they follow, from the things they react to. Because what they're not going to, like if Chinese media says Macau has got good weather, the Russians are not going to pick it up. They don't care, right? If they say something that really care, then they'll pick it up and they'll use it.
Yeah, I'm asking a slightly different question. So suppose there's an explosion in Damascus, then people who care about Damascus will tweet about it, possibly because they each independently observe the explosion, or because one observes it and the other one copies the first one. So right. Is it a matter of contagion or is it a matter of a common shock? And can you distinguish that?
Only over a lot of trials, right? I mean, because you said there's a confounder, and that is it's reported on TV, okay? It could be that doing both of them. But you still see a possible connection between them, but it could be a confounding connection. On the other hand, if you see that happen a lot of times, even when there's no obvious confounder or the confounders are very different, then there's likely a real connection. From the statistics point of view, these are really, really difficult problems to be able to we don't claim to have something that's magic. But if you watch it over a long period of time, you can get enough essentially natural experiments to be able to rule out most of the other sort of explanations.
False injected into one of the nodes and see if it gets picked up, and the others could not possibly have observed it except via that node.
Exactly. Yeah, good. So I'll just stop there. Have a new book, not exactly about this, but it talks about how we can protect ourselves from a lot of this sort of stuff, and maybe you'll be interested. So, questions? Nobody's asking. You're asking questions. It's great that you are.
Yeah, we have one question following up from an earlier part of the presentation. Can you circle back on the echo chamber comment? And what does the data that you have say about the effects of echo chambers?
So we have echo chamber observations, not just that there is one, but that the communication pattern induces a echo chamber, both for physical interaction, so people moving around cities. It turns out that people self-segregate in where they go, where they feel welcome. And that has implications in terms of long-term economic growth and growth in certain communities and so forth. You see it in Twitter and so forth like that. And the framework that I apply to it, and I think this has a lot of stuff going to it, is that people are looking for opportunities to do better, right? And they're looking to avoid bad things, okay? And that's the character of our life. It's not about education or things like that. It's about trying to find these right strategies. And education helps, but actually probably helps mostly by associating you with the right people as opposed to giving you the right facts. And if that's the case, then what you need to do is you need to break down the physical echo chambers as well as the digital. So the data that we have, and I don't have the paper, on a slide here, the data that we have pretty strongly suggests that it's physical segregation, and by that I don't mean necessarily racial segregation, like income segregation, other sorts of segregation, that drives segregation on social media. It's most apparent when you talk about red versus blue. Well, the red guys live in the countryside, the blue guys live in the cities, they don't see each other, they don't talk to each other, they have very different ideas, right? And we know that when you separate people like that, their ideas become increasingly divergent over time. It's just a natural, sort of thing. People talk to themselves and they tend to wander off. We have many examples of that. So, one important aspect of all this echo chamber stuff is that you have to break down physical segregation as well. It's not just residential segregation. Our data show that the majority of this segregation effect is about people not feeling comfortable mixing with other people. It's behavioral. You get out, like the average person gets out in a city, travels something like 7 kilometers a day. They pass all sorts of people, but they don't go in places where there's other sorts of people very much. So there's very little mixing. One of the more interesting things is that if you want to promote mixing, this is experimentally, right? This is observationally. Things like coffee shops are great. All sorts of people go to coffee shops. They mix more there than they mix in almost any other place. And we can show that it has an effect on their future income, community income.
I have a question in the last couple minutes. So a lot of this was motivated by the preferential attachment, and mostly talked about either having him or not. Maybe are there? You looked at a lot of different cases and examples. Is there a parameter where you can see that some situations preferential attachment is more important versus less important, and the effects are different? Have you ever seen it change in one of these settings? Like, is there a dial where we can say, okay, as preferential attachment becomes more important, you get more of these tail effects? If you turn it all the way off, you don't.
Yeah, certainly. So when a good example is when someone moves to a new neighborhood, they don't know where anything is. They don't know what's a good restaurant, where's a good, and so they copy other people. So that's a preferential attachment process. When they've lived there for a while, they don't do that as much. Similarly, if you notice, like with the scam coins, the people that had been in trading coins for a while were much less influenced by these new announcements and so forth than the people that were new to it. They felt like they understood the situation more. When we looked at the financial experts, not all financial experts were affected by preferential attachment. And they made a little bit more money, but they also made more mistakes.
Well, that's interesting. So actually, that wasn't what I was thinking, but that's really interesting. So there's like heterogeneity in the amount of preferential attachment within a setting.
That's right.
That's fascinating. Another thing is heterogeneity across different settings, that some settings, or maybe within a setting over time, that just that preferential attachment becomes better because maybe the technology for retweeting is cheaper versus becomes more difficult because they put friction in there or other phenomena. Have you seen or studied any cases where there's a change in the importance of preferential attachment, and that does that lead to these changes in these kinds of outcomes?
So let me just show you one thing that's sort of interesting, and I'd have to think about whether this is actually a preferential attachment thing, but I think it is. So this is Ethereum. Like most of these things, it has a power law distribution of number of interactions, so the out degree, in degree. But if you look at, this is the in degree over time, you see this nice oscillation. And so, from the time it began, there was this huge sort of, Ethereum, this is wonderful. Everybody like getting on and trying to do things. And what happened over time is that the amount of connections and the strength of the connections decreased, fairly small. So this is.
That's the coefficient. That's the size of the power law coefficient that changes over time. Is that what the y-axis is?
This is actually the average in degree.
Oh, in degree. Okay, gotcha.
Okay, changing over time. And it's very predictable. It's really rather remarkable. You could, if you were right here, you could predict what was going to happen for the next couple of years, which you could trade on if you wanted to. But
time. I mean, I don't want to read too much into it, but it sort of oscillates a little bit.
Yeah, so you remember I showed this thing where we were making small purchases and moving the market? So I think that this is, I like to think of this as like this sort of trampoline surface. And if you bang it, you get these vibrations over time. And here the big bang is we just set this thing up, right? And there's all this stuff about Ethereum, and now it's damping out over years.
That's very close to what I was thinking. So it'd be amazing to do a similar chart for lots of other markets and see if there's that sort of phenomenon.
Right. Because you have to remember that the price history here is incredibly chaotic, right? People look at it, this is like crazy, right? But this is extraordinarily predictable over years, right? So it's interesting to sort of think about how that's affecting the price signals and what else is going on there, right?
We are
good.
out of time, I'm afraid. So thanks very much, Sandy. Appreciate you sharing that research.
Yay.
And I think, Christy, do we have Chad Jones? You remember what the date is? All right. If you're interested in coming to Chad Jones's talk, the date is on the website. What's that? It's April 3rd. So see you then.
Good. I think the beginning of that, I didn't